Good morning folks, Ken Ring of www.predictweather.com. It's the 16th of May and this is the day of the northern declination. So the moon is in the northernmost point today, and after today it starts to make its way south, and this is because of the tilt of the earth, and it'll be up here sort of in the sky when we're talking about the midpoint of the moon for each day, because that's what this model depicts. It's when the moon is directly above your head, which happens every day, of course, but at a different time, because the moon gains 48 minutes a day. And today it's going to be about there. Don't forget, it sort of rises here and then it reaches its midpoint and then it sets round the back there in the west. So after today it's going to start rising in the sky in the southern hemisphere until it gets further over our heads, and then that's called an ascending moon. That happens from now on for the next 13 days. Of course, if you're in the northern hemisphere, it'll start to go down because the southern hemisphere is the one that's away from the northern hemisphere. I don't know if you can follow that, but we do repeat this situation quite often for you to try and get a bit of an understanding of how this cycle of the moon happens. It's in the northern latitude at the moment, and it's about 24-25 degrees latitude. Now this varies, and it gets to as far as high as 28 degrees latitude in some years, and this is an 18-year cycle turnaround. So it was last at 28 degrees latitude, and that's the highest it gets, the highest in the latitude of the world, and it 13 days later it ends up 28 degrees south, so it covers a bigger range of the world, and that was in 2006, and that's called a major standstill time, or maximum declination. And the moon's range, if you like, for each month going between north and south is getting less, and then it works its way up higher again like that. So 2006 was the last time it was at its maximum. Another 18 years takes you to what, 2020 or so, 25, and that'll be the next maximum declination. So when it's at its maximum, it brings a whole lot of heat because the moon's high in the world, if you like, at the higher latitudes, and it sends down much more heat from the equator around down here. So you tend to get droughts around that time, and you tend to get a lot more evaporation, but it doesn't actually fall because there's so much heat coming off the ground that the clouds are kept buoyant, and it's not until the clouds end up over the sea that they drop their rain. So if you're talking about Australia is heading for about a decade now of wetter than average conditions. Well, when I say wetter than average, I should say wetter than the last decade has been, because that doesn't apply to all states. So the next decade is going to be slightly wetter than the last decade has been, which is good news for farmers, and that's because where the moon is operating between lesser latitudes, north and south. And of course, when it's doing that, it's creating less warm situation. So if you like, slightly cooler, and that will lead to more evaporation, which will lead to more rain. So that's, I think, what's coming up. Of course, Australia goes through 35-year cycles, 30 to 35, between the 1860s and the 1890s. That was a cold and wet period, and then from the 1890s to about the 1930s, you got the Great Federation drought around about the 1900s, and that was a drying period, a warmer and a drier period up to about the 1930s. And then from the 1930s to the 1970s, well, that was cool and wet again. And it was so cool and wet that by the 1970s, they were thinking that the whole world was thinking it was going into an ice age, and there was a whole lot of panic about that. But then from the 1970s to the 2000s, that was another hot and dry period. And we've kind of turned the corner there. And from now on, looking ahead at least a couple of decades, we're looking at a cooler trend. And really, when you're looking at that, you're looking at the when you're looking at the temperatures, you're looking at something that's happening on the sun, and it's a 35-year, 72-year turnaround altogether, 35-year alternation of these cold and wet and hot and dry periods. And it's to do with the sunspot cycles, these are cycles of the sun which in turn are to do with what Jupiter and Saturn are doing when they get on either side of the sun. It's like the moon and the sun on either side of the earth, or when Jupiter and Saturn in their orbits get on one side of the sun together, it's like the new moon and the sun on the side of earth. What happens is more gravitational pull is exerted on the sun by Jupiter and Saturn when they get in those positions, and that increases the tides on the sun of electromagnetic activity, and that sends more electromagnetism over the earth here, which translates into more solar radiation. So that's really the cycle of our temperatures, and that leads to droughts, and that leads to this cold and wet and hot and dry sort of alternation. So what I'm saying is, we're entering a cooler and wetter period than it has been in previous decades, a couple of previous decades. So that's good news for Australia, I think. Good news for farmers. You won't see the drought word as often. I mean, you're going to see it in places. For instance, this winter coming up, June, July and August are going to be fairly dry for most states. Not Western Australia, but most states. And we'll talk about that tomorrow, what's coming up for Australia over the rest of the year. Just a quick overview. Thanks for watching. I hope you get something out of these talks that we give.